the spontaneous brain, from the mind-body to the world-brain problem. This is the title of my recent book, which comes out in MIT Press in September 2018. And I want to give you here a short overview of the three main parts of the book, and each part of the book will be covered by one talk. The first talk is about world, brain, and consciousness. In the first part of the book, I basically discuss a lot of recent data from neuroscience about the model of the brain and how they are related to consciousness. So, the main claim in the book is, first, we need to consider the world in order to understand the mind and the brain. And specifically, we need to understand what I would call the world-brain relation, how the brain integrates and aligns to the world. The first main claim is consciousness is about the world. We experience ourselves as part of and integrated within the world. For instance, I'm standing here and I experience myself as part of the wider auditorium and in relation to you. And this is what I try to symbolize. And that has major implications. Consciousness not in the head. Consciousness consists in the relation between you and me. So I have a perspectival relation from my own perspective to you. And that makes my consciousness. If my brain loses the capacity to create that relation, I will lose consciousness. Secondly, neuroscience and philosophy, particular philosophy of mind as a special branch of philosophy, neglect the world. The concept of both brain and mind and subsequently the mind-body problem ultimately remain worthless. But by forgetting, neglecting, or eliminating the world, they basically cannot get this relation between you and the rest of the world, which basically is an intrinsic feature of consciousness. And if you forget the world, then of course you revert to something else in order to attribute consciousness. Then you come up with the idea of a mind. And then you have what is called the mind-body problem as the question for the relationship between mind and body. So we need to reintroduce the world and our concepts of brain and mind to give justice to consciousness. Once we consider the world, we can shift our concepts and our problem. We can go from brain and mind to world-brain relation. And the mind-body problem can then be replaced by what I like to call world-brain problem. However, how can we conceive such a world-brain problem? You might say that this is counterintuitive. Does Dr. Northoff now mean we have no mind and we have no consciousness or sense of self? No. Far from the truth. The opposite. I take very seriously your experience, your subjective experience of yourself in the relation to others. Meaning I take very seriously your consciousness, your sense of self, your feeling of a free will, your emotional feelings. But what I deny is that we need to attribute them to a mind as a separate entity. There is no evidence for such a mind. They don't come from a mind. Mental features are usually by philosophers attributed to mind. And when you say you reject the mind, then it seems that you also reject mental features. That's not what I'm doing. I preserve mental features, attribute them to world-brain relation, and hence speak of a world-brain problem. And that has to be distinguished from a mind-body problem, which then is basically no longer necessary, superfluous. However, to conceive that, we need to put the brain into the context of the world. We cannot just consider the brain as a center of the world from which we perceive and conceive the world. Instead, we need to take sort of the perspective of the world and how the brain is part of that world. Meaning, we need to do something what Nicolaus Copernicus already showed us how to do. He put the Earth into the wider context of the universe. The Earth was no longer the center of the universe. Same in our case. We cannot not conceive the brain as the center of the world. Instead, we need to conceive the brain as part of the wider world. That amounts to nothing less than a Copernican revolution in current neuroscience and philosophy of mind. That will be the third, one of the main theses in the last part of the book, and also the third talk which I will give. So, the book contains 4 parts, and I condensed them into 3 talks. The current talk is about world, brain, and consciousness. It's part 1 and 2 of the book. I basically establish on empirical grounds and empirical evidence for a world-brain relationship, and that is central for consciousness. So that's a more empirical, neuroscientific, theoretical part. The second talk, part 3 in the book, goes right into deep philosophical issues, meaning into ontological issues. Ontology is about existence and reality. And for the philosophical experts among you, I make a sharp distinction here between ontology, on the one hand, concerning our natural world, and metaphysics concerning all logically conceivable worlds. My talk and all my statements about the world-brain problem are ontological statements as they concern only the actual natural world we live in. In contrast, I refrain from any metaphysical statements about logically conceivable world. So when I speak about a world-brain problem, I refer to an ontological problem and not a metaphysical problem. The third talk will be about the need for a Copernican revolution. The intuition of mind is very strong because we think we need to attribute consciousness and other subjective phenomena to some kind of entity called mind. I say that need, urge, or intuition to attribute to a mind is an illusion. So how can we get rid of that intuition? For that, I say that we need to change our viewpoint, our vantage point, and basically, as I already indicated, conduct a Copernican revolution. So we need to develop a different methodological strategy how to conceive the brain. This will be the 4th part in the book and the 3rd talk in this series of talks. Let me start with the first talk about world, brain, and consciousness. Brain is in. You see the brain everywhere. You go into the internet, you go into the mental health market, everybody talks about the brain, train your brain, and here, this was a supermarket in Armenia, even in sweet stuff, you see get brains. You can even eat your brain. Your brain is everything. I will tell you, your brain is just part of the story, world brain. So, the main question in our times, at least for my generation of researchers, is how can the gray matter of the brain yield something as colorful as consciousness and other subjective features like sense of self, free will? My focus in this book and in my talks will be here on consciousness. But this book is not about consciousness. I just take consciousness as a placeholder, as a paradigmatic example for mental features. I could have taken another mental features like sense of self. My group does a lot of research on the sense of self. Or feeling of free will. It's just consciousness I take here as a paradigmatic example how the gray matter and its neuronal activity of the brain transforms or translates into subjective phenomena like consciousness. So, the 2 main claims I will try to convey in this talk and in these first 2 parts of the book are, first, we have different models of brain. So we need to consider models of brain. In philosophy, this alludes to the discussion in philosophy of science about models in science. So, and you will see without explicating that here, for the experts among you, I here follow the line of models, scientific models, as developed by Nancy Cartwright and others. Firstly, we require a particular model of brain to account for mental features like consciousness. So my first part of the talk will be about models of brain. Second, that model of brain implies a spatial temporal characterization of the brain and henceforth a spatial temporal characterization of consciousness and other mental features. So, and you will see here, I refer to time and space as basic constituents of the world. Time and space are not a given. They're not they're not pre-established. They're continuously constructed and the data support that. I will show you that. So just sort of to give you a hint in which direction and what I mean by space and time. That will be the second part of the talk. First part, model of brain. The first model of brain is basically the brain is like a car, a purely mechanical device. You push the gas pedal, and the degree to which you push the gas pedal, the car will speed up or not. So there's a direct linear relationship between the degree of your gas pedal push and the degree of speed. And that amounts, in the terms of neuroscience, to basically the brain as an input-output device and as a behavioral or cognitive reflex-like apparatus. At the beginning of neuroscience, at the beginning of the 20th century, Charles Sherrington, for instance, said, okay, the brain passively receives sensory input. The emphasis here is on passive. And then it produces an output, a motor output. That input-output device view has been somewhat modified, complexified, by the sandwiching of the cognitive dimension between input and output. However, ultimately, even the cognitive view of the brain, as in current cognitive neuroscience, which is a big field in neuroscience, basically still obeys to the purely mechanical input-output structure. And I symbolize that in the paper in 2012 here in Trends in Cognitive Science. You can see, for instance, you receive a stimulus, here's a Colosseum from Rome, and your brain processes it, and it produces some task-evoked activity. And you see here on the right side, that's what we call task-evoked activity. But then the question is, where do consciousness, sense of self, and other mental features come from? Because the brain only processes the stimulus. So you leave, with this view, by default, you leave a gap between what the brain is supposedly doing and mental features. The brain-mind gap, as philosophers like to say. However, there's another view, and that has gained more traction in recent years, but can also be traced back to the beginnings of neuroscience. Let me go back to the car first, before I go back to neuroscience. Here, now, imagine you're moving out of this auditorium after the talk, and you're tired, and this Northoff talked a lot, enough, I can't hear this anymore. And suddenly you stand out of the door, and you see your car moving back and forth in spatial temporal trajectory. And just, you haven't bought yet a self-driving car, so it's not one of the Tesla cars yet. And you say, what's going on? So your car is moving in constantly spatial temporal trajectories, back and forth, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes a little bit more in this direction and here and there. And you're wondering, this is crazy. No. This is exactly what your brain is continuously doing, and it continuously constitutes spatial temporal trajectory, a virtual, non-observable spatial temporal structure. And you will see here this throughout all three talks. This virtual spatial temporal structure is central. Yeah? So it goes from one point to another, and when you, over time, you reconstruct the movement of your car or your brain's spontaneous activity, you get a delicate spatial temporal structure, as tried to indicate here in this picture. So, and this spatial temporal structure is essential to understand the brain. For instance, the brain has neuronal activity, as you know, a spontaneous activity which is not directly related to external stimuli. It's also called sometimes resting state activity, but that's an oxymoron because the brain is never really addressed. If it were truly addressed, meaning zero, it would be dead. Your brain's activity fluctuates. And it fluctuates in different frequencies. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower. Here, and these frequencies have different names. Gamma between 40 and 180 Hertz, beta between 13 and 30 Hertz, alpha between 8 and 13, theta between 4 and 8 Hertz, delta between 1 and 4, and then you have also the very slow range. And here on the side I indicated that you can measure that with different techniques like fMRI. You have heard this, EEG, faster frequencies. So and that means this is very important here. The brain constructs its own inner time, like the car which moves out there. And conceptually, you might want to speak here of the brain's inner time, as distinguished from the outer time which we observe from the outside. And the same holds for space. The brain creates a virtual inner space, which all kinds of architecture, nodes, hubs, a complex neural network, as people say these days. And these networks have different kinds of properties, connections. Just imagine when you're sitting in the airplane and you fly to China or wherever and you look at the geographic map where your airline flies, you see a complex network with hubs, certain airports, nodes, and so on. The same, the inner space of your brain. So this raises the question, what is the proper model of the brain? The brain has an inner time and space. And I argue that that inner time and space of the brain is not inside the brain. Because, as you will see later in my talk, it connects the brain in a virtual way to body and world. That's why I speak of world-brain relation. However, when you perceive a stimulus, like here's the Colosseum of Rome, your brain approaches that stimulus with its own intrinsic activity. And you will see this here in the orange line here in the brain. That's the fluctuation in your spontaneous activity. And then it depends on the timing of your spontaneous activity fluctuations and the timing of the stimulus, what the stimulus will induce. Meaning that what we call stimulus-induced or task-evoked activity is a hybrid between the stimulus and the brain's spontaneous activity. And that mixture, I argue, yields mental features, like consciousness. And since your spontaneous activity adds its own spatial-temporal structure, the resulting mental features are intrinsically spatial-temporal. Spatial-temporal in a virtual way. That sounds very abstract, but it's like a virtual reality which your brain continuously constructs in its interaction. And I will mention some of the data on that, but obviously you can see more of that, of the empirical detail, if you happen to be a neuroscientist, in the various papers on our website, where we explicitly pursue such a spatial-temporal approach for consciousness, self, and psychiatric disorders. So here you can see that that's a spatial-temporal structure, and I argue that mental features like sense of self and consciousness are virtual spatial-temporal features. Now, let me go a little bit more into empirical detail, particularly with the model of brain. Our spontaneous activity, the activity is continuously active, is neither fully passive, meaning it's not just receiving passively the sensory stimuli. That's an empiristic model of the brain, or passive model, as I say in the MIT book, which goes back philosophically to David Hume. David Hume had an empiristic view of the mind. It's basically just a sensory and cognitively processing organ which passively processes stimuli. Against that, the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant set a different model of mind. Here the empiricism was replaced by idealism. Now the mind was not just passive but purely active. So he associated a complex apparatus to the mind with different layers. So here the mind was no longer passive, receiver of sensory input, but an active cognitive processing organ. That's led what philosophically is called idealism. So interestingly, you can see the philosophical lines of the 18th, 17th, 18th centuries with respect to mind, empiricism versus idealism, resurfacing in the current models of brain as either passive or active. However, I argue that neither really holds. The brain is neither fully active nor fully passive. Instead, it covers the whole spectrum. Stimuli are in a way passively received but actively modulated, and the pure activity is not as purely spontaneous. Because in the brain there's a continuous mixture between input and internal processing, between external input and internal brain processing. So just imagine when a brain was sitting here in the first row, probably the brain would say, what is he talking about? I'm not passive, I'm not active, I'm neither internal, I'm not external. It's not me. So imagine you dance a tango. In a tango, it's always with two people. And they're extremely interdependent on each other. Yeah? So the tango as a whole results from the interaction between the two. Same in the case of the brain. The brain needs to interact continuously with the world, the external with the internal, in order to make possible mental states. So mental states, like consciousness, are basically like what you observe at tango. And that requires a lot of relational interaction between the two dances. So, the interesting thing then is that the philosophical views of empiricism and idealism are basically just extremes on a spectrum of possible activities in the brain, where you have different kinds of balances between active and passive processing. And that ultimately leads to what I call spectrum model of the brain, or also interaction model between spontaneous activity and internal external stimuli. So Hume and Kant were right and wrong. They were right, they had one aspect, but these were just one extreme of a spectrum. And I discuss a lot of empirical evidence for that in the first 3 chapters in the book. And for instance, then you might raise the question, then how does the brain interact with the external world? There are different kinds of mechanisms. We call this rest-stimulus interaction. And this is a major line of research. And that rest-stimulus interaction occurs apparently in a nonlinear or non-additive way. I spare you the details. You can see this in the exact papers. My work. Now, I showed you the first part, the model of brain. It's neither passive nor active. It's an interaction. It's a spectrum model of brain. What does this imply for our model of consciousness? And that spectrum model of brain has a strong spatial-temporal component because it rests on the spontaneous activity construction of space and time. So now, how do we get from that model to consciousness? The second part of my talk. For that I say the brain's relationship to the world is central. So this will be the focus in my second part. And even more important, time and space are the common currency between world, brain, and consciousness. Imagine, I'm from Canada, we have very harsh winters here. 6 months, a lot of ice, and then we have a very short spring, then the water becomes fluid, and then we can have a very humid summer where the water vaporizes. So you have 3 different states: iced water, fluid water, vaporized water. Now, imagine you would not know that in all 3 cases there is water. It's all water. You would assume that maybe for each of them there are different entities underlying, that are different things. Iced water is different from vaporized water and fluid water. And you would not even speak of water. You would just speak of fluid substance. You would speak of ice substance, fluid substance, vaporous substance, philosophically speaking. So for each you would assume a different thing. But then we understood, okay, all 3 are water, and then we understood how they can transform into each other. When it becomes warmer, iced water transforms into fluid water. And then if it becomes really hot and humid, that transforms into vaporized water. So we currently, with respect to brain and consciousness, we are in the state where we don't understand that in all 3 cases, iced, fluid, vaporized, it is water and the chemical formula of water underlying. That's why we assume mind, underlying consciousness, and brain. However, I argue that the relationship of the brain to the world makes us understand how neuronal states can transform into into mental states. In exactly the same way how iced water can transform into fluid water. And for that, the common currency are time and space. The common currency in the case of water is water and the chemical formula of water. In the case of the brain mental feature of brain consciousness transformation is the time and space between world and brain. So time and space, the construction of an ongoing time and space dynamics of a certain structure, are the shared features between world and brain. The better the brain and its own inner time and space construction integrate and align to the ongoing time and space construction in the world, the more likely we will have mental features and become conscious and have a stable sense of self. So time and space are the common currency between world, brain, and consciousness. Let me show you some of the details. Again, you already show this picture. The brain constructs its own inner time. And that inner time, and that is important, shows what can be called temporal nestedness. So you have these different frequencies of activity, faster in the upper part, slower in the lower part. However, the slow frequencies have much more power than the faster frequencies. Imagine you're just coming back from summer vacation and you stayed a lot of time at the beach. I'm sure you observed, or your kids might have noticed, they are fast waves. The fast waves, by default, they're fast, but don't carry much power. However, I'm sure you warned your kids against the big waves, the slow waves. Because the slow waves have a lot of power and they can be very dangerous but pull you completely away. Same in the brain. The slower your frequency, the more powerful they are. The faster the frequency, the less powerful. And that amounts to what is called scale-free organization, and basically a kind of temporal nestedness. The faster frequencies, less powerful, shorter durations, nests and are contained within the more powerful, slower waves. Same as at the ocean. You have a big slow wave, very powerful, and a couple of faster waves nested within that slow wave. That's exactly how your brain constructs its own inner time. Temporal nestedness. What do I mean by nestedness? Typical example, spatial nestedness is a Russian doll. The smaller doll is nested and contained within the next larger one, and so forth. Yeah? And you'll be surprised. Another one, another one, another one. And they all become larger. This is a typical example of nestedness. That's what the Russians did. But you know, Chinese civilization was even earlier and much more advanced. And of course, there's basically nothing what the Chinese didn't already do. Same here. So they have this beautiful ivory ball. And you see, Chinese manufacturing is unbelievable. And you see a lot of little Chinese nesting nests. They're concentric spheres in there. Typical example of nesting. Same with the brain in respect into its temporal structure as well as its spatial structure. We call this nestedness. So, what is important here? You have different spatial temporal scales and sizes, small to large, different durations, short to long. But what you see in the Russian and the Chinese example of nestedness, there's a certain self-similarity. They're different in size, but similar in shape. Same in the brain, you have self-similarity in the neuronal activity, or self-affinity. So and that creates a certain form of structure. And we call this, and the physicists and engineers among you know this very well, scale-free activities. And scale-free properties is ubiquitous in nature. It's not only in the brain, but in various phenomena like seismic earthwaves in the world. Here I give you another example, and you see these typical curves. You see this here, bottom left, the spontaneous activity, upper left, and then you reconstruct it, and you get what is called a power law distribution. On the y-axis you see the power, and on the x-axis you see the frequency, and you see the slower the frequency on the left of the x-axis, the higher the power on the y-axis. So that's a typical example of scale-free or self-similar activity in the brain. And we and others showed in various papers that the brain's scale-free organization or temporal nestedness is central for mental features like consciousness. When that breaks down, as shown in this recent paper, when the brain's scale-free or temporal nestedness breaks down, consciousness is lost. That has been shown for anesthesia by us, as well as in sleep by others. You can see, for instance, see here, this is the difference. You see the upper part, the colorful brain is in the awake state. Then you see the blue brain in the anesthetic state. And that's the difference basically in the scale-free activity. And here in the lower left, remember, you had on the x-axis again the frequency, and on the y-axis the power. And you see that particularly in the slow frequency, here the red curve is the wake state, and the blue curve here, the flat curve, is the anesthetic state. And you can see that the power in the strong waves, the slow waves in the anesthesia break down. So basically, you might still have, like if you were sitting at the ocean, you might have still some fast waves, but otherwise the ocean is completely flat. Meaning there's no dynamics, no slow waves, no different waves, no nestedness. It's very calm as breakdown. Yeah? Nothing happens. That's basically the state of your brain in anesthesia when you lost consciousness. So dynamics is good. You need to have dynamics. If you have a complete flat ocean and your brain is completely flat in its activity, it still shows activity, but it doesn't change. It's not variable, no waves, no different power, no difference in the power between fast and slow waves. You lost consciousness. So this is why a former postdoctoral student in mine, Zirui Wang, and me developed what we call the temporal-spatial theory of consciousness, where we link different temporal-spatial mechanisms of the brain to different mental features of consciousness. You can read this in the respective papers and books on our website. So the temporal-spatial nestedness within the brain is central for consciousness. So you need fast waves, slow waves, a complex amalgam of different waves in your neuronal activity to sustain consciousness. And our temporal-spatial theory of consciousness must be distinguished from other neuroscientific theories of consciousness. I cannot go into detail of that. You will see a recent paper of ours where we compare the different theories of consciousness. You see in my Unlocking the Brain 2014 the discussion of these theories. I just want to say one of the most popular here, the integrated information theory, is based on information rather than the construction space and time. And basically it's focused completely on the brain itself, and it is not, it's neuroinformational rather than neuroecological. Yet another much discussed theory is the global neuronal workspace theory by Stanislav Dehaene, which is very cognitive, and again, rather than spatial-temporal, and is neurocognitive rather than neuroecological. So the two main distinguishing features of our own theory is really, first, it's about the brain's construction of its own inner time and space, and second, that it is intrinsically relating the brain to the world, a world-brain relation, and not just focus on the brain. That will become more clear, particularly in the second talk. So, what is consciousness? Consciousness is about the world. We experience ourselves as nested within and related to the world. I am part of the wider world. You say this is banal. I say no, it is not trivial. Because this being part of the world is an active construction process by your brain. If that active construction process breaks down, you lose consciousness. So that is not a given. Henceforth, that construction process is maintained by your relation of the brain to the world, how the brain aligns and integrates to the world. So consciousness is intrinsically neuroecological and based on what conceptually can be described as world-brain relation. I leave that out, and there's various lines of empirical evidence for that. But let me come back to the end of this talk. What is central here, how the brain aligns to the world. And there are various mechanisms for that, like phase entrainment, phase shifting, phase locking, matching complexity, which again goes much into empirical detail. I want to spare that here for you. We are actively investigating that these days. Hence, the brain's alignment to the world, temporal-spatial alignment, is central for consciousness. And I explicitly say here it's a world-brain relation, not a brain-world relation. The brain integrates itself within the larger context of the world. That is world-brain. The brain nests within the world. It is not the other way around, that the world is nested within the brain. Then you would speak of a brain-world relationship. But that basically would mean to squeeze a large Russian doll within a smaller one. Doesn't work. So then why do we assume it in the case of the brain? So, and once we have the world-brain relationship, That is the spatial-temporal relationship, and that is necessary for consciousness. Then we no longer need to assume a concept of mind. Then what is called mind-body problem can be replaced by a world-brain problem. That's, so far I only presented you empirical evidence. In the second talk, I will provide you more of ontological and philosophical evidence. Here again, I focus on the distinction between world-brain relation. The brain aligns itself actively to the world and its spatial-temporal structure. The world structures the brain. That must be distinguished from the brain-world relation, where we have cognition and representation of the world by the brain. So then the brain imposes itself on the world through its cognitive functions. The brain structures the world. I focus on the left one because that's why I said that is central for consciousness and mental features, whereas the brain-world relation is central for cognitive features. So cognition is not the same as consciousness and mental features. Cognitive features must be distinguished from mental features. I'm well aware that there are many neuroscientific, in particular philosophical theories, who consider mental features as cognitive or higher order cognitive features. However, there's a lot of empirical evidence now that cognitive features, like attention, working memory, must be distinguished from consciousness and other mental features. The same goes for the self. So based on empirical evidence, I here presuppose a sharp distinction and different neuronal mechanism underlying cognition on the one hand and mental features on the other hand. Mental features require spatial-temporal mechanism, cognitive features, neurocognitive mechanisms. And that leads me basically then to the world-brain relation. And now I come to the end of this talk. It's more the empirical line of things. Now I want to make the transition from the empirical to the ontological level. And that transition, including the ontological issues, really to establish the world-brain problem not only as an empirical problem, but as an ontological problem, will be the main purpose and focus in the second talk. Thank you very much.